old publications from my master's thesis. Another essay was from a conference on Derrida's signature event conference context uh, anniversary conference. And another essay is an unpublished one, which is about my reading of Derrida's Violence and Metaphysics. So, wait. While set in varying themes, the main thrust of the collection is to point out the relative stability of logocentrism as well as its necessity in the humanities. So I'm going against the usual way of reading Derrida as someone who would dismantle structures and whatnot. My objective this time is to show that while dismantling structures might be the agenda of uh, Derrida's reading of philosophical texts, it's also a possibility to look at the idea of logocentrism as something that pretty much is unavoidable in any discourse in the humanities. So originally, I planned a six-chapter collection, but due to unforeseen events, I have decided to limit the collection to five essays. One of the major issue that I had was the abrupt declaration that we're going to have an intensive course scheme for the delivery of lectures on for the first semester. So hindi ako nakapag-plan kasi biglaan lang siya nangyari, and I was supposed to pace my research and my writing. However, since nagkaroon nga ng intensive courses, ngayon pa lang ako actually magko-continue dun sa research ko. So the chapters are as follows. Of course, the first one is an introductory discussion of logocentrism, and of course, some relationship of it with Derrida's idea of deconstruction. The second chapter is entitled "The Paradox of Fixity and Difference," and this essay covers the nuance of logocentrism and the issues surrounding its representation. The third chapter would be entitled "Iterability and Difference." Most of these chapters, as you can see, are already published. We're just republishing some of these essays. And of course, the third chapter is an essay which covers the Derrida and Searle debate and how they dispute the idea of parasitism in J.L. Austin's speech act theory. The fourth chapter is entitled Eliciting a Sense of Normativity in Derrida Through Hornet's Recognition Theory or Theory of Recognition. Of course, this is also a published essay. I cover, of course, the issue of normativity and the other under the context of Hornet's recognition theory. So it's more of looking at the similarities of how normativity could be read as a form of logocentrism, that it is something that we might need to oppose. And on the other hand, it is something that we also strive to create a sense of normativity. Now, the last chapter is currently in progress. My intention there in that chapter is to discuss Derrida's idea of the economy of violence. Okay. Once more, of course, this would be a reading on uh, his essay, Violence and Metaphysics. So that's my current chapters for the book project. So again, I've mentioned currently I have issues with the intensive courses and the disruption of planned schedules, which would require me to, of course, request another extension with the publisher. And of course, the new projected date for completion would be hopefully on December 2020. At least yung manuscript, ma-complete ko siya. And of course, proofing can follow after I complete the manuscript. Now, my second project is an application of my the theory that I've been working on in, of course, my PhD studies. And a system of pathology, the firearm cultures in the Philippines, is premised on the possibility of using what I would call as reconstructive normative simulations to assess pathological issues in the firearms industry. So it's something that I've been looking forward to apply. Actually, this was a project that I've been working on around 2018. Siya dapat yung research project ko, but of course we had the CHED CPE project, so I have to shelf this project, and now I'm going to continue this research. So the premise of this research is to investigate the firearm culture in the Philippines, and my intention is to look at the relationship existing between the state, private individuals, and the firearms industry to locate pathological instances that are expressed but not limited to activities such as crime, rebellion, and illegal trade. So the philosophical and critical premise, as I've mentioned, would be based on my previous research. And at the moment, I am also considering a possible collaboration with an anthropologist or a sociologist to provide the empirical basis for this research. Otherwise, of course, I have to familiarize myself with the methodologies of those disciplines. So current status, I've completed most of the legal research on laws, proclamations, and policies regarding firearm ownership in the Philippines as a republic. So from Act number 1780 of the Philippine Commission to the most latest RA 10591. So I've made an early decision to exclude the Spanish laws from this study because of the lack of involvement of Filipinos in the legislation of laws. Okay, and it's something that's quite interesting to me also. However, I think I'll be very limited with the types of materials that I can gather if I have to uh, include Spanish laws, although that also might warrant some future interest in research. I've also collected news articles, related literature, mostly American sources, and general statistics on firearm related crimes. And one issue that I've found with the available statistics is that its method of collection is not very clear. Hindi siya kasing organized with crime statistics in the United States. And some of the data are not categorized properly, and to alleviate this solution, I may have to coordinate directly with the Philippine police. So initial findings, these are of course things that I've gathered in the course of my research. So it is interesting to note that the Philippines has a very similar historical context with the U.S. Firearm laws. Firearms have been very instrumental to revolutionary movements in the Philippines and also with the United States. However, unlike the US, of course, none of those revolutionary movements has been successful in the Philippines. So kaya merong protection ng America with the Second Amendment. It's because, of course, they've won uh, the revolution became successful. In our case, of course, we never became successful with any of these revolutions. That's why uh, the government is also always with the side of regulating the ownership of firearms. So there is a constant attempt from legislation to create regulations that can control firearm ownership through a nationwide registration. And the problem with that, of course, is that it's a difficult thing to do. Okay, and a lot of loose firearms are still in circulation today. In fact, if I remember correctly, one of the materials that I've read would say that there are probably more loose firearms than legal firearms in the Philippines. So the firearm manufacturing industry is thriving in the Philippines in terms of quality and quantity. Okay, and the only limitation that they have is access to better raw materials, which drives up the prices. So I've mentioned loose firearms, and they are usually sourced from security agencies by declaring it as a lost firearm. Politicians will have to bribe certain groups, okay, The NPA, for example, would require politicians to uh, provide firearms for them, okay, in exchange for allowing them to campaign or to run for an electoral position. Okay, and of course, theft, which is very rare, and illegal importation and through illegal manufacture. So laws such as RA 10591 indicate that firearm planting is a common practice in the Philippines. This is only based on how I've seen the laws. Okay, the laws are quite strict with the idea of firearm planting, which tells us that there's a precedent to that. Okay, there are additional penalties for civilians and police officers who commit this crime. Okay, supposedly, at least if they're caught. And it is common for civilians to have loose firearms for home defense. And the modus is to make it appear as if the civilian has wrestled his or her way to the criminal's firearm. And then, of course, palabasin na lang na dinala lang nung ano yan, criminal yan, and I was able to snatch it and use it against the criminal. Now, legal firearm ownership during the American period is interesting because it required a bond of 100 pesos per firearm, which is a lot in those times. And today, even before the RA 10591, and of course today, the transport of firearms is strictly regulated, not only for civilians but also for law enforcement agents. So even the police have to uh, apply for a carry permit if they want to carry their firearms while in civilian clothing. So it is also interesting to note that in the course of my study that Filipinos are actually highly regarded by the international community in the shooting sports. So maraming awards ang napapanalunan ng mga Filipinos for this, and they're usually not acknowledged by the government or the media. And despite this, of course, international acclaim, the average Filipino does not have proper basic firearm safety training. So likewise, the average legal firearm owner in the Philippines rarely practice basic firearm operation and maintenance, and all because of the restrictive laws for transporting legal firearms. So even if you own it, if even if you have papers for it, the other chore to overcome to take a firearm to the firing range, or at least to get some training, is also difficult. So all legal and licensed firearms have forensic ballistic records. However, this is not, as I've read in my literature, this is not a very effective way of registering firearms because barrels can get changed by just regular use of the firearms. And you'll be surprised, however, that compared to our American counterparts, the Philippines is okay with suppressors, or as Hollywood would call it, silencers. They're legal, but may require a permit if you want to manufacture one and sell it to the Philippine market. So the restrictive nature of firearm ownership laws is due to three factors: threat of rebellion and insurgency, crime, illicit trade, and manufacture. So while loose firearms are common, the government has tightened the regulations for the sale and manufacture of ammunitions. So, for example, it is not legal to own. It is not illegal to own firearms chambered in intermediate rifle cartridges, 5.56, 7.62, and it is not possible, however, to purchase this ammo. So legal, pwede ka magkaroon ng ganyang klaseng firearm, but you can't buy ammunition for it. So ammunition is also very costly in the Philippines, and it requires special permits if you want to possess more than 50 rounds. That's why I also found it interesting that despite the proliferation of firearms, hindi tayo nagkakaroon ng mga mass school shooting sa Philippines because of course ammunition is very scarce. Legal ownership is prohibitive and expensive. Training and practice requires special permits and it's also expensive. Transport permits used to be easier to acquire, and this is a point that I'd like to use my reconstructive normative simulation. And this is to point out a pathology that people um, would usually exploit the laws, and by exploiting these laws, the laws would become tighter or stricter. So that day you can actually have transport permits, but the people abused it. They carried firearms as if it was a carry permit, which is different. You're supposed to lock up the firearm if you have a transport permit. So inexploit nila, and then of course nagkaroon na ng issues, and the transport permit has also become very difficult to acquire, and it's very restrictive. So license to own a firearm also has to be renewed every 2 years. The process to conform to the requirements and permits is very bureaucratic and time consuming. And you have to do it every 2 years. And carry permits are only issued when a crime threatens the applicant. So privileged professions, of course, are excluded from this rule, which is surprising because it excludes medical practitioners, the clergy, politicians, lawyers, engineers, and business owners. So there are plenty of cases also in my research where I've found that there were instances of negligent discharges, mostly due to the lack of training. And it is surprising that this also happens to a lot of law enforcement officers. So even the police officers are also having trouble with training and basic firearm safety because they don't have enough opportunity to actually exercise those. Now, critical points or possible solutions. This is pretty much my suggestions in the course of the research. First, of course, is to allow legal firearm owners to transport their firearms without ammunition to training facilities, shooting ranges, sporting events. License to own and possess should be extended to 4 years. I've already, I think, meron ng amendment dun sa rules. Um, I'm also in favor of maintaining ammunition restrictions, which is a good thing. Okay, because it uh, dries up the supply of insurgents and terrorists and even the criminals. Criminals are usually limited by the kinds of ammunition that they have. And most of the time, they're very awful and poorly made uh, ammunition. However, your restrictions should apply to interest groups like politicians and security agencies because they've been the source of the proliferation of loose firearms. And government support should be given to competitive shooters because these athletes are actually winning international competitions. One of the things that I'm also going to propose in this research is the reintegration of illicit manufacturers and black market gunsmith to legitimate manufacturing companies. And you'll be surprised at the talent of actual illicit gun makers because they can really create a good hand finish and hand fitted firearms. In fact, a company here in the Philippines that hand fits firearms can sell a pistol around the range of 200 to 500,000 pesos because of the craftsmanship of hand fitting. So maganda siguro if may proposal ako doon for uh, telling the government that they can rehabilitate these illicit firearm makers and probably give them a good uh, a decent career in gunsmithing. Of course, I am also for the removal of exemption clauses for privileged classes for carry permits. So meaning all being equal, politicians do not get a pass for carry permits. Everyone has to go to the same procedure. Audit and destruction of confiscated loose and illegal firearms is also one of the things that I want to propose. And of course, further government support for legal manufacturers, because they are actually creating export products. So a lot of countries actually purchase Filipino-made firearms, and they're good in terms of quality and reliability. Now, my intention is, of course, to publish this research as a way to how would you say this? It's also my way of responding to a previous research on firearm proliferation and violence, because I think the way that firearms were presented in that research, I think it was done by a faculty from Ateneo, and I think the way it was done is, of course, uh, it's done as if um, uh, it was written in a way that kind of characterizes the kind of anti-gun campaign that they have in the United States. So yung mga it's written in the tone that Democrats in the United States have, and I think it's quite unfair to characterize the firearm culture in the Philippines in that similar manner, because people here are actually more careful, at least practicing competitive shooters and firearm training practitioners are quite different here in the Philippines. And even legal owners are very careful. So I plan to publish this. Perhaps it can lead to a bigger research application. And my plan to use the reconstructive normative simulation is going to look at the 3 points or three areas where individuals have to interact and create some normative conditions in the firearm community. Things like how the state, for example, creates laws, and how the manufacturing industry also creates certain norms, and of course how private civilians create certain norms. So hopefully I'll get some funding for this. I was thinking of requesting funding from the government, or perhaps some other private institutions. Now, to my last report, the Hornet Leader is already in the press at the moment, and this project was a project that I've been doing on the side. And it's a collection of philosophical essays from Florentino Hornedo. So it's this is the cover art. Yun lang naman. I'd like to pretty much thank the UST Publishing House for facilitating this project. Anyway, that's my presentation. I'd be happy to receive questions and comments about my projects. Hello. Hello.
Hi. Hello.
Hi, sir.
Hi, Arte. Good presentation. Ako yung moderator, no?
Yes, sir.
Tama. Okay. So the virtual floor is now open for your comments, for your questions.
Hello, Sir Jove. Maybe I could start.
Yes, the POW. Go ahead.
Excuse me. Hello, RT. Good evening.
Good evening, sir.
But the question is regarding your presentation with presentation on your research on gun laws in the Philippines or gun culture in the Philippines. Of course, if we compare our culture, our gun culture with the United States, um, the American Constitution actually, or rather the ownership, you know, of firearms is actually embedded. The right to ownership of firearms is actually embedded in the
That's
American.
the Second Amendment, sir.
Yeah, the Second Amendment of the American Constitution. Of course, we don't have that in the Philippines. My question is, well, first, I'd like to commend you for taking on this research because at least from my end, I seem to learn. I will expect to learn a lot from uh, our gun culture and the laws that are related to owning firearms in the Philippines. Something that I'm not really familiar with. Something that I have not really thought of looking into. Maybe because partly I'm not a fan of guns, you know. So just just to be candid about it, I'm uh, I'm uh, I'm not comfortable with the idea that that we should that we should have the, I don't know. Let me put it this way. Let me just ask the question: what guarantee? Of course, we have the right to defend ourselves,
Mm.
definitely. But what guarantee do we have that if indeed there is a law, for example, that will resemble the Second Amendment of the American Constitution, a law similar to that, that will be, um, you know, I call this basically approved and observed here in the Philippines. What guarantee do we have that we don't uh, uh, parang arrive we don't end up in the same situation that that America is in at the moment. America actually has uh, uh, what I would term as a crisis in gun ownership, because owning a gun in America is so easy. Uh, it's like buying a pack of cigarette here in the Philippines in a sari-sari store, or well, relatively easy, or buying a tag dito, a case of beer, right? Of course,
Uh,
they have regulations. You need proper identification, and you have to be on the right age, in the right age, and so on and so forth. But if you qualify, if you have those basic requirements, you could actually even purchase a firearm via eBay, or just like or online. There might be not eBay maybe, but there are online. I suppose there are online shops that sell guns, and there are gun shops, just like they have liquor shops. So it's relatively easy to own guns in the United States compared to the Philippines, compared here in the Philippines. But my worry is what guarantee do we have that we don't end up in the same situation, no? That we don't that it will not result in the same firearm crisis that the United States is, going through at the moment. Most of the violent uh, crimes that we hear and read about, uh, more most of them are linked to, you know, uh, precisely that relative ease that Americans have in owning firearms. Uh, but and then you mentioned earlier in presentation that that Filipinos are more responsible. I guess the question. So this is the second question. Uh, Maybe a certain sector will be responsible enough in owning guns, but I'm not too sure about other sectors. We have had reports every year during our I call this
New Year.
whenever we welcome a new year. A new year, every time we welcome a new year, there are always cases of not exactly gun violence, but precisely irresponsible people who shoot their guns and hurting people,
That's true.
innocent people, I mean, these are not even, most of them are not. I mean, some, well, most of them are usually owned uh, or done rather by police officers
Police.
who,
Or-
and however there are also cases where undocumented guns were used.
Mm.
But again, the same, going back to the same question I asked earlier, what guarantee do we have? I mean, if later on it's going to be relatively easy to own guns, it's just like buying a pack of cigarettes, just like in the United States. Uh, what guarantee do we have that things like uh, yung mga stray bullets during celebrations, and so on, and then yung crisis that might happen, that it's out of control. I mean, the problem with the United States that it seems like they cannot control it because it's in the Constitution. People actually think that it's their right. To some extent, what's going on in the United States at the moment, where people are para bang if you ask them to wear masks, right?
Yeah.
For them, it's a violation of their basic rights.
Mm.
And of course, politicians like Donald Trump use that for his own gain. Um, so anyway, yun yung question ko. So two questions, but in a way related. The second one is related to the first. So
Um,
thank you, Artie.
Thank you for that question, sir. Actually, for the first question, the question of whether we might become much like America is quite impossible at the moment. We don't have the right to own firearms. It is a privilege that we apply for. Okay. In the case of the ease of purchasing firearms in America, it's not actually a true thing. Actually, I watched this documentary about what's this a uh, a journalist trying to purchase firearms and try to prove that statement that buying firearms is like buying a pack of cigarettes or buying a case of beer. Eventually, he found out that all gun stores are going to have background checks, and lumabas dun sa background check niya na meron siyang uh, ano ba yung kaso niya? I think a domestic violence case. So he wasn't sold a firearm. And it's a misconception that it's easy to purchase firearms in America.
Well, just to perhaps interject there, it also matters when that maybe I don't know,
State.
documentary or
Mm.
program was shown, and whether the practice of background checking
It's
is a
still on.
recent
It's
is
still.
a recent development,
Mm.
maybe in recent years. But maybe it's if indeed it's a, I don't know if it's a common practice or it was only they only started it recently. Uh, uh, if you don't have any, if you turn out clear, in other words, if you don't have any, I call this criminal record, or whatever, um, in your file, then then they will sell you they will sell you, like I said, as long as you're clear and you meet all the requirements, then it's probably relatively easy. Now, of course, I was being hyperbolic when I said that it's like buying a pack of cigarettes. Pero if you have all the documents and you have all the, and you're clear, you don't have any criminal liabilities and you don't have anything that will hold you back from owning a gun. Kasi they have gun shops. We don't have those here in the Philippines.
Oh, we do.
I mean, it's not as common, right?
Yeah, it's not as common, pero there are places where you can actually. It's quite similar to gun stores in America.
Pero it's not as common. Talagang sa tingin ko, mas ano doon, yung parang siguro every block meron. Parang it's an open thing because it's the Second Amendment.
Yeah, but the thing is, it also varies depending on the state. So if you're from places like California or Chicago, medyo restrictive yung firearm laws nila. Even in the case of New York is also one of the most restrictive uh, state for firearm ownership. In Chicago, I think ang problem nila actually is illicit firearms, loose firearms, and not the new ones. The new ones that are used in crimes are usually stolen firearms. Anyway, to respond to the question, if we are going to be uh, somewhat if we're going to experience a somewhat similar uh, condition of firearm culture in America, I think that's also highly unlikely. And again, part of the fact that we can't be like that is because, of course, we have strict laws. Okay, and another thing is, of course, yung restrictions natin with laws. For example, of course, if you're American, walang restriction yan with the amount of firearms that you can have. In the Philippines, um, probably the maximum that you can have is 5, and if you want more, you need to uh, present to the police that you have a secure safe. So malaking gastos siya, and very few people go beyond 5. And the other cases, of course, is uh, the amount of ammunition that you can store. 50 is the maximum, and you can really see the limitation that we have with ammunition. So US, of course, you can stock 1 million rounds of whatever firearm or ammunition that you need. Here, of course, it's something that is highly restricted. So the fears of the Philippines, for example, becoming similar to America is quite far. Okay, at least in some other countries that have very good gun culture, like the Czech Republic. The Czech Republic is also a gun culture country. Marami sa kanila, even younger adults or uh, even children are trained early on to hunt with rifles. So maganda yung culture nila, and they don't receive as much press as America because they're very responsible about firearm ownership. Now, to respond to the second question, of course, in the case of responsible gun ownership, in the case of licensed firearm owners, we're usually given a heavy penalty if something goes wrong. So if I have an accidental or negligent discharge in my house, I could get my license revoked and all of my firearms confiscated. So yung mga nagpapaputok naman ng baril during New Year, I have to think, or at least I'd like to believe that most of the people who do that are actually people who possess loose firearms or unlicensed firearms. Because if you do that and you hit someone and they collect the slug, meron tayong ballistic database sa krame, and your name is going to appear on that forensic evidence, and you're going to get really all the legal penalties that would be associated with indiscriminate firing. So I think responsible gun ownership is possible in the Philippines if some of the restrictions with uh, transport and training is lifted. So yun yung number one issue natin here in the Philippines. While some people do own firearms, some people have a hard time trying to learn how to operate it safely, or how to use it safely. I know this for a fact because uh, I'm also a member of the International Defensive Pistol Association, and I'm also qualified as a range safety officer. So ganun yung problem natin with firearm ownership in the Philippines, that sometimes we think that what we Filipinos think that what they see in the movies or television shows are enough to teach them about firearm safety. And most of the time, of course, movies and TV shows depicting firearms are not the best idea to or the best practices that you can see. So if you visit a firing range, most of the time you'll be escorted by a range officer, and the range officer is um, pretty much going to restrict the way you handle and move around the firing range. So I think responsible gun ownership is a must in the Philippines. And the problem is that, of course, yung laws natin, they're quite restrictive. And again, as I've mentioned, the restrictions come from the fact that uh, the government has been trying to fight insurgency to the point that it also encroaches on responsible firearm ownership.
Okay.
So,
Yeah,
yes, sir.
Artie, merong question dito from Doc Bobby.
Sir Bob. Uh,
Uh,
the
yeah, you can
license
just read it.
the license to own and possess firearms up until now expires every 2 years. Yes, I also hate that clause on the laws. Uh, Compared to firearm registration, which expires every 4 years. You mentioned that the expiration of LTOF is currently being extended to 4 years. Based on your study, is this conducive to communal safety? Sir Bob, it neither contributes anything or removes uh, impedances in the owner in the responsible ownership of firearms. What I think would actually contribute to responsible ownership is, of course, the uh, privilege or allowing more and more legal firearms owner to have access to training and uh, practice responsible or safe firearms handling. Yun yung issue natin eh. And it had something to do with how the previous firearms laws was exploited, again by also by the same legal firearm owners. So mag-apply sila with a carry permit, which does not allow you to load the firearm or use it in a defensive situation, but allows you to transport it to the range. Ang problem, may mga taong nag-exploit nun, and the exploitation of that law led to the tighter restrictions with the transport of firearms. So the permit to transport firearms, starting from a 30-day period, naging 2 or 3 days na lang siya, and it's very hard to go to Grame, for example, just to acquire that kind of permit.
Okay. Thank you, Artie. Any other questions from the participants? Okay, kung walang magtatanong, may ano tanong ako, Artie.
Oh, siya. Yes, sir. Go
Yeah,
ahead, sir.
kanina kasi pinag-uusapan yung culture ng yun nga, gun ownership between the Philippines saka sa US. Uh, sa kanila, as you have mentioned, it's part of the Constitution. No? Pero sa atin, sa akin, ang tingin ko parang uh, yung perception ng Filipino sa pag-aari ng baril, parang dalawa eh. Yung negative na perception, they associate guns with violence. No? Doon naman sa positive, they associate guns with security, with safety, no? Yung parang protection sa sarili. Pero hindi pumapasok sa consciousness natin na yung guns pwedeng kagaya niyan, sabi mo, pwede siyang for competition. Ano?
Yes, sir.
Uh, sa tingin ko, parang iba kasi iba yung tingin ng Pilipino sa baril. Lagi na-associate nila yung baril sa either violence or personal security or safety mo. Pero lalabas pa rin na safety mo or security mo from what? From violence din. Di ba? Kaya yun yun ang nagiging common denominator, whether positive or negative yung perception. Laging napupunta doon sa violence na na-associate sa baril. Sa tingin mo, tama ba yung ganong perception? Or I mean, ang point ko is, sa study mo, pwede ba ma-validate yon? At kung ma-validate yun na gano'n nga yung perception, paano babaguhin yon? Kasi sa tingin ko sa'yo, iba yung perception mo sa baril eh. Di ba? Pero karamihan ng mga Pilipino, I'm speculating, pero best pass dito sa observation ko, na-associate nila yung baril sa violence, whether positive or negative yung kanilang perception ng baril.
Actually, sir, that's a very interesting point. There's an association with violence, of course, but also firearms owners do not want to shoot people. I don't want to shoot people. I don't want to ever be in that kind of situation where I have to harm someone or possibly even take someone else's life. However, yung problem natin with the issue of safety and security is that no one can guarantee that. Okay, that there would be bad elements in society, no matter uh, how good the society is or how bad it is. It's going to happen. Okay, so at least in my own perspective, owning a firearm is like owning a fire extinguisher. I don't want to use the fire extinguisher, but if I have to use the fire extinguisher, I have it. Yun yung point. I grew up in a very uh, uh, very, let's say, magulo na neighborhood. Okay, merong mga drug trade, merong mga criminals, and it's a common thing that I experienced as a child. So I am, of course, I don't want to be in that position where my life would be on the line or my family's life would be on the line. I at least would like to have an option to disagree. Of course, I am very much willing to take all the kinds of legal liability if that happens. Ganun yung perspective ko when it comes to firearms or ownership. At least you have a chance to defend yourself in court and not be 6 feet under the ground. So with regards to not only ownership but also with sports, maganda yung culture natin, at least with the people who participate in sporting events are actually very considerate. They're very safe, and they're not the actual kind of people that you'd think would be violent with firearms. Okay? I've seen supervised children also participating in shooting competitions. Last time na nag-compete ako, napakatagal na rin. I think I went to Naga. I saw a girl around 10 to 15 years old. She's also competing, and supported siya ng parents niya. And the girl's actually really good. And there are also some other younger people who participate in the sporting events. So may mga ano rin, may mga clause din tayo with the laws that would allow that. Of course, with constant parental supervision. Now, with regards to the perception of violence and crime, of course, I think one of the major things that uh, we have as a contributor to that kind of factor na when you see a firearm, you see someone who's violent, someone who wants to do harm to other people, is perhaps, of course, yung influence din ng media. And they're always depicted like that. And sadly, in legal firearms owners in the Philippines are not like that. Kasi ang laki nung burden, nung responsibilities when it comes to the law. Okay? We're required to constantly take drug tests, neurological testing. Dapat clear kami from any crime. So if you possess a firearm, it's not a license for you to be aggressive and be violent with other people, because if you do, ikaw yung may liability. You're only supposed to use that if your life is under threat. Okay, and yeah, that's my comment. And thank you for that question, Sir Joe.
Yeah, thank you, Artie. Actually, naisip ko yung competition kasi I don't know if you know Jetro Junicio.
Yeah,
He was my student way back in
sa
commerce.
commerce.
Yeah, estudyante ko siya. At yun nga, lagi siya nagko-compete, and one of the best shooters talaga si Jetro.
Ang bilis ni Jetro Junicio. I saw his videos, and he also owns
Yeah, meron siyang firing yata sa
may range siya dito sa Makati and sa Quezon City, I think.
Yeah. Diyan malapit sa West yata, meron siya yatang gun store yata dyan. I don't know kung gun store yan or something. Sa ano. Diyan sa may SM North pala, SM North. Okay, anyway. Thank you, Artie. Any other questions from our participants? Okay, so far wala nang magtatanong. So thank you very much, Artie, for your presentation, and good luck sa research mo.
Thank you, Sir Jove and Sir Pao, for the questions.
Looking forward dun sa reader mo, Hornet Reader. Finally, lalabas na yan.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, so that means ako na yung susunod. Aldrin?
Yes, sir.
Yep. Okay. Kanat. Oh, wait lang. So, let me just share my okay. There. Can you see my my screen now?
Yes, sir. Kita po.
Okay. So thank you very much. This is my my project, my research project, and it's entitled "Towards a Christian Anthropology." The intention is the purpose of this is to gather all my lectures, because some of these topics I have already covered in many of my some of the articles I've written, and the courses that I handled both in the undergrad and in the grad school. So just like my book on ethics, the final outcome of this would be kind of a book on Christian anthropology. So I will just have to think of a appropriate or suitable title for this one. So the outline of this work is as follows. I'll have my introduction, and then the second in the human person as a created being, an imago Dei. Under this topic, I will be relying on some of the lectures that I gave to my classes in metaphysics or theories on reality. And then the second or the third one is human person as a psychosomatic being, body and soul. I have some lectures and some articles on existentialism. Uh, the the idea is to put together this notion of man as a body and soul. And then the fourth topic is human person as relational, as rational. So this will be under psychology, reason, and will. Uh, this will also be informed by my discussion on my lectures in ethics. Then the human person as an existential subject, interiority, and personality. Uh, this is part of my lecture on philosophical anthropology. And then the next topic, human person as a believing subject, faith in man's relation with God. So partly part of my discussion on philosophy of religion and uh, philosophical anthropology. Human person as a moral agent, law and conscience. This is actually part of my lectures in ethics. And then human person as a sexual and loving subject. Uh, I draw inspiration on this from my work on love, uh, love and sexuality from Carol Wojtyła. And then human person as a worker, the dignity of human labor. This part of the project is informed by my lectures in business ethics. Okay, and then the next, human person as a social being, fellow man, family, and community. This is part of my lectures in philosophical anthropology. And then the last one, human person as a temporal being and his ultimate goal, transcendence, eternal happiness. This is part of my lectures in philosophy of religion and philosophical anthropology. So the whole project really is to put together uh, my my works or my different lectures and articles, previous essays that I have written in under one project. That is Christian. Then that is anthropology. I put there the Christian thing because my discussion will be informed by four Christian philosophers: Saint Augustine, Saint Thomas, Jacques Maritain, and Carol Wojtyła or John Paul II. Okay, so that's the outline of my work. So basically, some parts of this project have already been I have already developed some of this, but I have to modify them in such a way that they are developed towards one single purpose, one common theme, and that is come up with to show what man is from the perspective of Christianity. Okay, so that's the purpose of the intention of the project. So let me just read. Uh, so far, the general overview, the general concept of the project is already finished. I have my summaries or the general what do you call this? The general topic, the general introduction for each of these chapters. Okay, and I have also developed the outlines per chapter already. So what I'm going to do present here is the general overview of each of these chapters. Okay, so let me just begin with my introduction. Within the landscape of philosophy in today's world, you find a vibrant mix of philosophies that offer different analysis and critiques of contemporary social, political, cultural issues. This is very promising for philosophy. The beginning of the 20th century, the focus of philosophy was more on the human person and society, especially as society modernized itself. The majority of the philosophers were critical of the Christian perspective. Some, in fact, were against religion, specifically Christianity. However, there were occasional voices of the Christian perspective. Jacques Maritain and Karol Wojtyła, in particular, who were contemporary students of the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas. They continued the legacy of the teaching of the angelic doctor by reinterpreting and renewing our understanding of the main tenets of St. Thomas to make them applicable and relevant in the contemporary world. So, even though amid the overlapping and crisscrossing of ideas and critiques of contemporary issues, the Christian voice or perspective is somewhat muted or ignored because of the prevalence of other philosophies. And we can always turn again to the Christian perspective, which was initiated by the Middle Age thinkers like St. Augustine and St. Thomas, and renewed by contemporary thinkers like Jacques Maritain and Karol Wojtyła or John Paul II. One particular subject matter or issue that is so relevant today is the human person, because the way we understand the human person will affect or influence we understand the whole of reality, the society, and the many other issues attached to it. There are, of course, many anthropologies or interpretations of the human person. And aside from these different anthropologies, there are prevailing anthropological issues and problems that surround the understanding of the human person. There is, first and foremost, the reductionist positions about the nature of the human person. Materialism considers man only as a material or physical being devoid of spirituality. Individualism takes man only as a separate and independent being, subjugating his social nature. Totalitarianism ignores the freedom of man and considers man only as a part that serves the interests of a totalitarian regime. Such reductionist positions dehumanize and violate the very dignity of the human person. Aside from these reductionist positions, moral relativism and emotivism undermine the objectivity of moral values and the role of reason and will in man's moral decision making. Some anthropologies have questioned man's recognition and relation with God, undermining his faith in the divine being. There are issues about personal identity which blurs the genuine identity of human person based on being created in the image of God and his God-given and natural sexual identity. There is a problem of the egoistic and utilitarian interpretation of love and human sexuality, which reduces love and sexuality to a mere pleasure generating relationship. And then, of course, there is the denigration of human labor, which reduces labor to mere economic activity for the sake of generating more profits. In effect, it alienates human labor and the worker from the product of his work. Moreover, finally, there is there are more issues about the final destination or ultimate goal of man, questioning man's desire for eternal happiness. These issues and questions are not entirely new, but they are again at the forefront because of the secularistic and individualistic tendencies that prevail in the modern world. It is quite challenging to address all these problems and issues that confront the human person. Although a critical stance against these different anthropologies is possible by addressing the problems one by one, I think a more appropriate approach is to go back to our own Christian perspective and relearn, reintroduce, and renew our understanding and appreciations of our Christian tradition, teachings, and ideals. What is needed, I think, is to highlight the Christian perspective of the human person, which calls for a reintroduction of Christian anthropology. This Christian anthropology is inspired by the great thinkers of the Christian traditions from the Middle Ages down to contemporary time. Therefore, in this paper or in this work, I will focus on reintroducing Christian anthropology based on the thoughts of St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, Jacques Maritain, and Karol Wojtyła or St. John Paul II. So the whole project really is a kind of uh, uh, response to the different issues confronting the human person in today's modern world. Okay. So the first topic is human person as a created being or an imago Dei. The human person is a being created in the image and likeness of God, and as such enjoys an inalienable dignity. The book of Genesis tells us that God created man in his own image and likeness. Male and female, he created him. Man depends on God for his existence and activities. This basic dignity comes directly from God's creative act, not from any action on the part of man. By creating man in his own image and likeness, God made man what he is. However, how do we understand what man is? According to Aristotle, what man is understood in his act. And what or how a being is, so it acts. Action follows being, and operation follows essence. The essence is the principle of operation and is known through its operations. In the case of man, the highest operation is intellection. And St. Thomas showed that intellection is a spiritual operation, and therefore the human soul is a spiritual substance. St. Thomas's reasoning proceeds more precisely from the immateriality or spirituality of the object of intellection to that of the human soul. From the immateriality or spirituality of the object and immateriality of the operation, we know the immateriality or spirituality of the intellect and the immateriality or spirituality of the subject, man himself. Here, man is constituted by his material and immaterial components, namely the body and soul or spirit. The soul or spirit animates the body, makes it move and act. The soul is the principle of life and activity of the human being. According to Karol Wojtyła or St. John Paul II, this fact about the relationship between the body and the soul is of basic importance for understanding the whole uniqueness of the human person, as well as explaining the whole structure of the human person. It is because we have a body and a spirit, we are different from all other creatures. We are unique from all other creations of God, and therefore, and because of this, we, the human person, occupy a very special place in the whole creation of God. Because of our spirituality, we are images of God. Man is an image and likeness of God. So that's the overall tone, the gist of the first chapter. The second chapter is on the psychosomatic nature of man as body and soul. And I rely here on first from the discussion of Aristotle and then move to a discussion of St. Thomas Aquinas. Aristotle explains the union of the body and the spirit through the hylomorphic analysis. Hylo means matter and morphe means form. According to Aristotle, being or ousia is composed of matter and form. According to this doctrine, all corporeal beings are made up of two principles, matter and form. The term corporeal means bodily. Corpus means body. Corporeal beings are of two kinds, the animate and the inanimate. An animate being is a living being or a living organism, like plants, the animals, and men. An inanimate being is a non-living being, stones, house, book, phones, etc. In non-living being, the form is not called a soul. It is just a form. The soul can only be found in living beings as the principle or source of life. So the plants and the animals have souls as the principles of their lives. In man, the soul is called spirit. The matter is this physical principle of man, and this physicality is manifested in his being a body. A human person has a body. The form is a spiritual principle, and this spirituality is manifested in having a spirit or a soul. The soul is the one that gives life to the body. So when the soul or the spirit leaves the body, and this happens in death, the body is left lifeless. So for a man to be a complete and alive human being, there must be both body and soul that are substantially united. The soul, meaning the soul of man, is called the spirit, is a substantial form of the body. The soul animates the body. It makes it move and act. The soul is the principle of life and activity of the human being. This complex constitution of the human person is composed of the material and spiritual aspects that makes the human person unique from all other entities or beings in the world. Like the other beings or entities, we can be considered an object, but we are also subject because of our nature as a human person. As a subject, we are an entity that exists and acts in a certain way. We are an objective somebody. Hence, Theuas says, as an object, man is somebody, and this sets him apart from every other entity in the visible world, which as an object is always only something. So objects are something, the human person is somebody. Now, the next chapter is on the human person as rational, as having reason and will. Both the body and the spirit have their respective powers or capacities. The spirit or the soul operates through the mediation of the faculties. And the two highest powers of the spirit are intelligence through reason or intellect, and rational volition through the will. It is through reason and will that the spirituality of man is manifested or actualized, and through which man realizes himself. According to Carl Wojtyła, based on the activities of reason and will, the whole psychological and moral personality takes shape. As a substantial form of the body, aside from the spiritual powers, the soulless powers or faculties that are intrinsically dependent on matter or the body. These faculties are the sensory faculties, namely the cognitive faculties, which are the senses, and the appetitive faculties, namely the emotions or feelings. And since they belong to the concrete human being, these faculties are also found in the person and therefore contribute to the shaping of the psychological and moral personality of the person. So following the thoughts of St. Thomas, Wojtyła asserts that all the faculties of the human soul work on perfecting the human being, and therefore they contribute to the development of the human person. Now, the next chapter is on human person as an existential subject, interiority and personality. Here I sort of combine the ideas, the positions of the existentialists and the phenomenologists and that of Jacques Maritain. So, as an existential subject, the human person is not just a part or member of the species or just a logical construction or an idea. The human person exists as a concrete human individual. He's fully alive and he exists in the world. He acts and makes decisions and determines his actions. What concretizes man's existence is his body, that is, his human body. Hence, the human person is an embodied subject. Further, man is not just a concrete embodied subject. He's a being or subject who exists in the world. He is a being in the world. He engages and relates to objects in the external world. However, while man expresses his subjectivity through the body, his expressions are in the form of human actions, both conscious and self-determined. He is a person in act, an acting subject. It is through his actions that he expresses his subjectivity. So when he acts, he expresses not only subjectivity, but also his freedom. So human actions are conscious and self-determined actions. The human person creates his own personality in essence out of his freedom. So a human person is not fixed like object. is the capacity, he has the capacity to choose and determine his actions and self. He can always choose within the limit of his finitude how he will act and live. According to the French philosopher Jacques Maritain, the human being is caught between two poles, the material pole, called individuality, and the spiritual pole, called personality. Because man is derived from matter, then he is an individual. But since he is also derived from the spirit, then he is also a person. Individuality signifies man's unity and simplicity. Personality signifies the interiority of the self, which is derived from his being spiritual, and therefore it also signifies an inherent dignity as an image of God. That is why man is not just a human individual, but also a human person. More than a physical being, man is spiritual because of his spiritual nature, created in the image and likeness of God. So, while individuality signifies man's being part of the world, or a fragment of the universe, and a determinate being in a physical world, as a human person, man, as a spiritual being, has the capacity of creative unity, intelligence, free will, and freedom. All right. The next chapter is on man as, or the human person as a believing subject. So I focus here on the faith of man and his relationship with God. The human person as a finite and created being recognizes his creator and establishes a relation with him. He recognizes that there are things that are beyond his power, his capacity, and understanding. Moreover, therefore, he longs for that being, God, who is able to somehow provide for him, complete his own deficiencies and limitations. This basic human experience provides the existential basis of man's belief in the divine being and religion. Religion is an expression of man's relation independence of the divine, particularly on God. The human person is a subject at worship. An important part of himself is relation with God, and religion is that part of his life wherein he can relate with God. In the social context, in the context of many people or the bigger society, religion becomes an institution or a human institution. Faith is the human assent to the divine or the spiritual being inaccessible to man's natural cognitive faculty. For St. Thomas, faith, like knowledge, is an intellectual act and habit of assent. However, since the object of faith is beyond human cognition, the human person is not sufficiently moved by the object to accept it as true. And therefore, by an act of the will, he inclines himself to believe. On the other hand, knowledge implies assent motivated by a personal seeing or direct seeing of the object without any direct influence from the will. The disposition to believe as articles of religious faith where objects of belief have to do with divine matters which exceed man's cognitive capacity is regarded as a special gift from God. However, faith is informed by the scriptures, which contains the revealed truth from God. The first revelation of the divine truth was made to the Jewish people through the patriarchs and prophets. And these revealed truths would eventually be the foundation of the Judeo-Christian faith. Prayer is the most intimate form of communicating or relating to the divine or to God. From the depth of man's spirit, there is a longing for relation. Man communicates with somebody because he wants to relate with him or her. The somebody to whom man communicates with is no ordinary person or being, but a being who is all-powerful and all-knowing and all-loving. That whatever he asks of him or whatever he tells him, that being, God, will understand and God will grant. Now, the next chapter is about man as a moral agent And I focus here on two standards of morality from the Christian perspective, namely law and conscience. The human person is endowed with rationality, and because of his reason, he can deliberate and make conscious decisions. He is also endowed with free will, through which he determines his own action, its course, and objectives. Since man is a rational and free agent, he is responsible for his actions and for the consequences and the quality of his choices. Because of human freedom and responsibility, the human person is always concerned with what is right and what is wrong. As a rational agent, he contemplates on doing what is right and avoiding what is wrong. The end of all this, of course, is his desire to live a well-lived life. The rightness or wrongness, or the goodness or badness of an action or conduct, is the main concern of morality. Morality sets standards by which we can measure or judge whether a conduct or an action is good or bad. And in Christian ethics, we have two norms or standards of morality, namely conscience, which is the uh, proximate norm of morality, and laws, whether divine, natural, and human, which are referred to as the ultimate norm of morality. Conscience, as a proximate norm of morality, is the one that initially tells us that an action is good or bad. At the same time, it is also the one that bothers man when he has done something wrong. In this regard, we are told to always keep a righteous conscience, a conscience that judges an action as right when it is objectively right, and an action as wrong when it is really wrong. The laws, namely the divine, natural, and human, are the ultimate norm of morality. They are the ultimate standards by which man judges the morality of an action, and we are always advised to follow the law. The divine and natural laws ultimately determine the rightness or wrongness of an action. An action, therefore, is moral if it is in accordance with our conscience and the law. Now, the next chapter is on man as a sexual and loving subject. The human person is capable of loving, was created by God because of love, and therefore he is also capable of loving and deserves to be loved. And it is true love, meaning conjugal love, specifically, that man and woman enter into a marriage or marital union. And as persons, they enter into marriage. The framework of marriage ensures that the partners treat each other as persons, making an authentic person through an authentic manifestation of his sexuality. Human love will always be related to human sexuality. Human sexuality is an integral part of the human person, and it defines the human person either as masculine or feminine. The sexual act has its own basic nature and natural ends, which is not just to give pleasure to the person, but to be the process that would bring to life another human being and thus perpetuate the existence of the human species. The next is on human labor, the dignity of human labor, man as a worker. When God commanded man, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, he commanded him to work. Man is the image of God, partly because of his mandate, from the Creator to subdue and dominate the earth. In carrying out this mandate through work, he reflects the very action of the Creator. Work understood as a transitive activity, which is an activity that is initiated by the human subject and directed towards an external object, presupposes a specific dominion by man over the earth and its resources. All the resources of the earth can be discovered and used through work for the benefit of man, for man's needs. So, as a person, he is a subjective being capable of acting in a planned and rational way, capable of deciding about himself, and with a tendency to self-realization. As a person, man is therefore the subject of work. As a person, he works. He performs various actions belonging to the work process, independently of their objective content all these actions must all serve to realize his humanity, to fulfill the calling to be a human person that is by reason of his very humanity. The next topic is on human person as a social being, fellow man, family, and community. As human persons, we are a being that exists in the world together with other human individuals. Not only do we exist together with others, we live, we act, we feel, move together with others, and in the process, relate, interact, and connect with them. We definitely depend on others for our needs, and we form a network of interdependence and interrelations. This shows our social or intersubjective nature. Intersubjectivity is a general sense, in a general sense, refers to the basic feature or element of our human existence. In being a human person, of being interrelated with other human persons. Our existence is characterized by the fact that there are other human individuals aside from us, that we are not alone in this world, and that we relate with one another. When we act together with others for a common purpose, we consider the common good or the common purpose as a good that is common to all. This good that is common to all is a value that all the members of the group recognize as something that will enhance their individual goods. Without this common recognition of the value of the common good, the members of the group will not work or act together. So it is in the common good, a recognized value that unifies the members together. So a group becomes a unity. It requires a dynamic unity because of the recognition of the value of the common good. It is the common good that provides the basis for the good's dynamic unity. Boitiwa calls this group, which is composed of the plurality of subjects or members of a community. A community is not just a collection of individuals. It is not just a plurality of subjects. What defines a community is the dynamic unity of the members because of the recognition of the value of the common good. And then the last part is man as temporal and his ultimate goal. So I sort of juxtapose his temporality and his transcendence. The human person is not an infinite being. We will not live forever. So sooner or later, our life will come to an end. But man's ultimate goal and destination is not here in the present life. As a being created by God, which we have discussed in the first chapter, the final destination is eternal happiness in the company of God. Man always desires happiness, and he aspires for happiness in this world. However, according to St. Augustine and the other Christian philosophers, man's ultimate destination is God. And that means spiritual and transcendent. St. Augustine insists that although man achieves a certain degree of happiness in the physical things, for they are reflections of God's goodness, man cannot conceive of true happiness without the permanence that only God can assure. It is impossible to attain true happiness here in this world, for the world is finite and can only provide man with things that are temporary and fleeting. Excuse me. Man, or God, as the supreme object, is a natural goal of man's activity, the ultimate resting place of man's love. Since man's desire for happiness is a love of God, no created good can capture man's heart except by presenting a reflection of the absolute good and portraying the countenance of God. St. Augustine stresses that through its creative act, man's will receives direct participation in the subsisting goodness, God Himself. And it is for this reason that the movement of love can find repose only in God. As St. Augustine said, our heart is restless until it rests in thee. So that's the end part of this project. I start with first chapter, God, man being created in the image and likeness of God as a being created in the image and likeness of God as an imago Dei, and then he goes through all these phases, these aspects of stages of his life, and then finally, in the last chapter, I discuss his coming back to returning to God. Okay, so that's my presentation. I hope you have some questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Aguas. So we are now accepting questions. You may use your microphone or the chat box to ask your questions or question. Anyone who'd like to start? Yes po. Anyone?
Nakatulog na sila, nagutom na siguro.
Oh,
Or comments, perhaps?
Sir Jove,
Yes, Franz.
si Franz.
Yeah.
Yung curious question lang yung sa akin. Doon sa apat na what do you call that? Your four
Philosophers.
philosophers. Oh.
Yeah.
Yung bang Christian anthropology, talagang masabi natin na itong sila yung apat na major sources of Christian anthropology, o meron ka pang naiisip while you are doing the project? Meron ka pa i-consider pero eventually hindi mo na isinama? Meron bang ganun instance when you were doing the project? O talagang itong apat na to yung masabi natin, the four pillars?
Siguro in the course of writing this, siguro baka meron pa ako makita, but ito kasi yung sa akin, first, si St. Augustine at saka si St. Thomas, sa akin, sila yung main representatives ng kanilang era. No? Augustine represents the patristic era. And of course, from the scholastics to St. Thomas, we can still consider, siguro from the scholastics, St. Bonaventure maybe, or Alexander of Hales, and the other scholastics. So sila yung kinuha ko, and not only that, mas familiar ako sa kanilang ideas, no? Kasi sila yung talagang inaaral ko, at they are always part of my lecture, of my lessons, etc. Si Jacques Maritain, maaring doon sa kanyang panahon, no? So yung nakita ko kasing main representative, kasi ang pinakahuli siyempre si Carol Wojtyła, very recent, sa kanyang panahon, siya yung nag-embody, since kinuha ko na si St. Thomas, may continuity kay Jacques Maritain, and eventually kay Carol Wojtyła. No? Maaring meron pang sabihin natin Christian na thinkers or philosophers na pwede kong makita, pero since inumpisahan ko dun sa kay Augustine at saka kay St. Thomas, para lang magkaroon ako ng continuity, sinundan ko yung tradition na yun, yung inumpisahan ni Augustine, ni St. Thomas, and then carried on by Jacques Maritain and of course Carol Wojtyła. Marami pa dyan siyempre na ibang Christian philosophers. Yung iba dito actually pwede mong sabihin, Marcel for example, pwede mong, kasi nababanggit ko rin si Marcel. Marami pa, but itong apat na ito, sa tingin ko, yung connected yung kanilang thoughts. So madali kong madaling ituloy pag dikit-dikitin, pag kabit-kabitin yung kanilang mga concept for a Christian anthropology. And not only that, sila rin naman lagi yung binabanggit kapag when you talk of Christian anthropology. And I'm taking Christian anthropology, Christian here, following yung tradition ng Christianity from the patristic down to St. Thomas. Siyempre, pagdating ng Reformation period, nagkaroon ng sangayan, yung Catholic at saka yung Protestant. Pero sinundan ko yung tradition na from the Christian era down to the Catholic, no? Hindi ko na yung sa Reformation, yung sa Protestant for example, or sa Orthodox. So yun ang naging flow, kaya yung apat na yun ang kinuha ko. Aside from the fact na kabisado ko sila talaga yung inaral ko.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Franz.
Anyone else po? I'd like to ask Dr. Aguas anything related to his discussion.
Sir?
Yeah, Venus.
Ay, good evening po. Sa akin po parang clarification lang, sir. No?
Yeah.
Maybe I misunderstood, but it seems to me that one of the motivations of the project really was because modern societies are now parang puno na ng secular philosophies. Kaya, and the Christian voice is being silenced. Parang ganun po yung part ng motivation ng project sa pagkakaintindi ko. My question, sir, is hindi po ba with the structure of the project or how you approach it, na parang galing agad tayo sa theological foundations, wouldn't it automatically exclude or disengage from those secular philosophies? Hindi po ba the way to engage these secular philosophies would actually be to maybe have a secular reading of these philosophers kung posible, parang secular reading ni Aquinas or ni Augustine, parang ganun yung clarification ko po.
Okay, that's a good point. First, doon sa term na hindi naman siguro Christian anthropology or Christian perspective is being silenced, pero may may asterisk yung silence na yun. Parang namumute siya. Hindi siya, it's not silence as being silence na kumbaga para siyang nalulunod doon sa dami ng mga philosophies, no? So dumadami siyempre sa punto ng philosophy, okay yan kasi maraming boses, maraming mga, sabi ko crisscrossing yung mga boses na yun. So doon in that context medyo nasa silence kasi nga hindi masyadong nabibigyan ng atensyon, hindi masyadong nabibigyan ng importance kasi nga napakarami, no, ng mga boses. Parang marami na nagsasalita. Na tutunin natin sa ating discipline sa philosophy, okay yun kasi maraming punto de vista. Now, doon naman sa yung dahil theological, dahil ito yung sinundan, pwedeng hindi na makapag-engage dun sa secular, yung kung ano yung ibang philosophies na yun. Sabi ko nga doon sa introduction ko, pwede siyang i-address, no? Pwede nating i-engage yung ganong mga philosophies. Okay? Like for example, let's say sabi natin secular reading ni Aquinas, secular reading ni Augustine. But sa akin hindi yun yung motivation ko. Sabi ko, pwede kong gawin yan, no? But for this project, mas magandang balikan yung ano ba talaga yung sa tingin ko yung Christian anthropology. Let's go back to the roots. Let's go back to the basic teachings. Saan ba nag-umpisa ito? Ano ba talaga yung position ng Kristiyano? Kasi kuminsan, ang nagiging problema in most cases, gusto natin mag-engage sa iba. Halimbawa yan, engage natin yung ibang philosophies. Pero hindi naman natin alam kung ano talaga yung atin. Hindi natin alam kung ano. Halimbawa, isang example na lang. Gusto natin magkaroon ng Thomistic reading or secular reading ni St. Thomas. Pero hindi naman natin alam kung sino si St. Thomas, kung ano yung sinabi niya. Gusto natin makipag-engage from a Christian's perspective yung ibang philosophy. Pero hindi natin alam kung ano yung atin. Alam mo ako, ano ba yung Christian na sinasabi ko? Okay, so ang point ko doon is, yes, we can do that, but mas maganda sigurong tumingin muna tayo sa sarili, sa akin, no? Yung Kristiyano, tingnan muna yung sarili niya kung naiintindihan ba niya yung kanyang sariling posisyon. Kasi kung hindi mo naiintindihan yung posisyon mo as a Christian, as a Catholic, for example, as a Christian philosopher, for example, you will just do a disservice first dun sa sarili mong perspective at saka dun sa kausap mo kasi magbibigay ka ng maling impresyon dun sa kausap mo. Di ba? Kasi hindi mo naman naintindihan pala yung sarili mong posisyon. So, if we need to engage with the secular philosophies, for example, engage sa kanila. Also know their own philosophies. Actually, ang nagawa mo yon, you can have a secular reading. But of course, pwedeng gawin ng iba yan.
Okay po,
Thank
sir.
you,
Thank you po.
Do we have any more questions po?
Hello.
Yep. Yeah, go ahead.
Jove, si
Yes.
Oscar.
Yeah. Hindi ko nakita dito sa ano. Sige, go ahead.
Maklaro ba?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Sige. Ang question ko ay, pag sinabi natin Christian anthropology, ano ang relation niya sa church teaching, Catholic church teaching? Is this Christian in a wide sense or it is Christian in a Catholic sense? Kasi I have a feeling na parang it sounds more Catholic than Christian in trying to involve all other Christian churches like that, no?
Yeah.
But then if it is more closer to the Catholic teaching of Christian anthropology, then how do we know that it is the Christian anthropology? Because your sources are, of course, we have the saints, no? But it doesn't mean that parang meron bang cross what you call this reference where it is being also supported by the authority or by the church, what encyclical or what Christian church teachings that embody this teaching of the saints, no? Augustine, Saint Thomas, and Maritan, and the other one is Butewa, no? So what I mean is that when you present this as a Christian teaching, I had the idea, parang it comes to me as if it is more related or connected to the teaching of the church, the Catholic Church particularly. And if that is the case, then is there a cross-reference with church documents wherein you can say, this is the Christian teaching. This is a Christian teaching, official, something like that.
Thank you, Dr. Ka. First, regarding yung gamit ng Christian, my sources, of course, this is philosophy, no? So I will be relying on the philosophical thoughts of these philosophers that I mentioned, no? Augustine, Aquinas, Maritan, and Wojtyła. And So doon pala makikita mo yung trajectory ng yung trajectory ng project, that it will start from the Christian perspective, meaning by Christian perspective, the general perspective of Christianity. Okay? From the patristic. Kasi yung time na yon, kaya nga doon ako nag-umpisa para masakop ko yung kabuuan ng yung Christianity na yon, no? Kasi si Augustine is prior to the Great Schism of 1000s, and then of course prior si Aquinas dun sa Reformation. So kita mo kagad na iba yung hindi siya Catholic in that sense, kasi nag-umpisa ko doon sa pinaka patristic era. Okay? So and then hindi ako makakaroon ng the project is not intended to support or to base my study on Catholic, or not Catholic but the Catholic Church documents. Hindi yon. Pero makikita natin dito na many of the documents or the teachings of the Church, of the Catholic Church, that means meron siyang philosophical foundation. Okay? Yung teachings ng simbahan tungkol sa tao, merong philosophical foundation. At makikita mo yung philosophical foundation na yun doon sa anthropologies nila Wojtyła, nila Maritain, nila Aquinas, at saka ni St. Augustine. Now, siguro ang gagawin ko dito, especially when I discuss this doon sa introduction, kailangan ko i-develop doon sa introduction ko, explain kung ano ibig sabihin ng Christian dito. And paano ito magda-diverge pagdating doon sa halimbawa ideas or philosophy, hindi church doctrines, doon sa philosophical views from the perspective of the Orthodox, for example, and from the perspective of the Protestants or the other Christians. Okay? Kasi wala namang, like for example, I'm not dito sa outline na ginawa ko, I did not mention any particular church teaching or Catholic teaching. This is Catholic, yes, pero pag tinignan mo yung because it's philosophy, sasakupin niya yung iba. Okay? Meron akong article on yung complementarity ng faith and reason based on sa reading ko on Fides et Ratio. Actually, doon ko kinuha yung paggamit ko ng Christianity, kasi I traced there kung paano nag-evolve yung Christian philosophy na yon. From the teachings of the early fathers of the church, hindi lang si St. Augustine, no? From the early fathers, from the early Christians, when they took in the Greek thinkers, like for example from Saint Paul, taking some of and the early leaders of the church, taking in the ideas of the Greeks, down to Augustine, down to the scholastics, etc., etc. So yun ang take ko ng yun ang magiging trajectory ko sa paggamit ko ng salitang Christian anthropology. It's actually inspired by my paper on Christian philosophy, which is informed by both philosophy and by theology, by reason and revelation. So yun ang of course it's a big challenge, kasi kailangan ko mag-provide dito ng parang historical background on that. And dito sa work ko, yun ang magiging purpose nung introduction ko. I will address yung question na yon about paggamit ko ng Christianity, magre-reference ba ako sa Christian doctrines or Catholic doctrines or Catholic teachings. Yun, so doon ko kailangang ayusin yon bago ko pumunta doon sa mga specific na chapters. Thank you, Doc Oka.
Siguro final question po kung meron pa po. All right, sige pa. I think if you have any more question later, I think you can use the chat box naman po. Is it okay po if I start na po my presentation?
Yeah, sure, sure. Thank you.
Sige pa. Um,
RT, are you still there? Doc RT? Sir RT, if you're still there, you are the moderator for Allison. Thank you.
shall I start na po, sir?
Yes, Allison.
Yes.
Sige pa. Hi everyone, good evening. So tonight I'll be reading to you a section of my thesis proposal. So yeah, I'll begin. Utopia and Possibilities for Social Change, Herbert Marcuse's activist model of critical theory. Herbert Marcuse, one of Frankfurt School's very first members, propounded a different model of critical theory. He developed a critical analysis of society that became widely popular among activists in the 60s and 70s. In fact, he was once considered as the guru or father of the New Left for a short while. This was attributed to his close attention to the student movement and other social movements at the time. As Angela Davis notes, one of Marcuse's lasting legacies is showing the possibility of being a scholar and an activist at the same time. This points to Marcuse's different approach and critical theory from the other members of the Frankfurt School. Interestingly, the integration of social movements in his writings is informed by his radical philosophy that developed the value of utopian thought. In essence, Marcuse's project had really been directed toward the quest for radical social change. However, it seems that the connection between his critical theory and utopian thought needs some clarifying, specifically on how his activist model of critical theory pushes toward transcending utopia to promote possibilities for social change. Establishing the relationship of the above mentioned offers a better understanding of his model of critical theory as regards its logic of having and struggling toward better alternatives. So the main problem or the question really that I'm trying to answer or that I'm trying to look at in this proposal is how does Marcuse's critique of society and utopian thought promote possibilities for social change? Hence, this proposed research aims to reconstruct Herbert Marcuse's activist model of critical theory in the attempt of presenting a more sustained and organized discussion on his message of transcending utopia, that is, a concrete struggle for liberation and social change. By so doing, the study can contribute to clarifying what some scholars of Marcuse have previously discussed merely in passing. Indeed, a reconstruction of Marcuse's activist model of critical theory, this proposed research argues, this is basically the overarching argument, is necessary in shedding light on the role it plays alongside utopian visions in promoting possibilities for social change. Now, a common feature present in the first generation of critical theorists is a commitment and underscoring they had toward dialectical thinking, a contrast to the more ubiquitous identity thinking. Such was present, for instance, in Horkheimer and Adorno's work. In fact, in their seminal work, Dialectic of Enlightenment, we can see a thorough investigation and analysis of the pathological tendencies society has come to experience as a corollary to the development and progress ascribed to instrumental reason in the form of science and technology. Apparently, dialectical thinking guided their critique of the wrong state of things, to quote Adorno, in society, as they argued that insofar as human progress in various areas of life has been experienced by many, individual and collective misery nonetheless remained, if not exacerbated. Such sentiment and critical analysis were shared by Marcuse, but he took a slightly different direction in his object of investigation. To be sure, his model of critical theory, albeit in consonance with most of Adorno and Horkheimer's analysis, incorporated other facets in society that were integral in his writings. In fact, in One Dimensional Man's Introduction, Douglas Kellner, who is a very famous Marcusian scholar, writes that two tendencies emerged specifically in the 1940s within critical theory. To quote, one, the philosophical cultural analysis of the trends of Western civilization being developed by Horkheimer and Adorno in Dialectic of Enlightenment, and two, the more practical political development of critical theory as a theory of social change, social change proposed by Marcuse and Newman. This more practical political development of critical theory is precisely what this paper will attempt to reconstruct to clarify the relation between his critical theory and utopian thought in promoting possibilities for social change. Of course, Marcuse employed the notion of dialectics as well. Against the dominance of positivist thinking, he formulated a critique of the various areas in society by invoking negative thinking, a thinking that breaks away from the traditional ethos of merely accepting ideas and conditions at face value. This involved a criticism of society's conditions in the hope of highlighting what is rational and what is not. What he observed was that despite the advancements seen in society, especially in democratic and wealthy societies, pathological conditions remained and to some extent had become even more appalling. But for some reason, he also noticed that such attitude was not shared by most people because of how the system has utterly transformed our way of life and thinking. This critique of society becomes clearer and more cogent in his seminal work, One Dimensional Man. In essence, the book draws heavily on on the repression and domination of a highly capitalist-driven society to the extent that one's critical impulse is gradually taken away from the individual as he gets absorbed and assimilated into the system. With great contempt, he reasons that this is largely because capitalism has brought privileges and excessive satisfaction to individuals to the point where questioning the problematic and irrational system has become almost unnecessary. Privileges that have been presented to individuals through technology, entertainment, and the like, have blinded those that consume in a market-dominated society, all the way from universities up to the government. This denotes that individuals have forgotten and are deliberately repressed from imagining potentialities and alternative realities through the development of false needs, for example, by the forces that control and benefit from the capitalist system. This posed a tremendous threat because Marcuse was of the opinion that individuals' critical impulse contained a powerful force in opening possibilities for social change. But like a highly pessimistic intellectual, Marcuse brilliantly explicates the entrenched domination of the system and the almost inescapable and inevitable oppression and repression present in society. Indeed, it is for this reason that Marcuse is considered a pessimistic thinker. Nevertheless, while it is true that Marcuse's critical analysis of society is pessimistic in nature, it is also argued that a remnant of hope remained in him. Interestingly, some of his thoughts throughout his writings evolved. This is especially true when many protests across the world were simultaneously happening, which at a certain degree debunked his critical analysis of a one-dimensional man, bereft of any critical potential. Such phenomenon was monumental for him because it demonstrated possibilities for social change. Indeed, Marcuse was a firm believer in radical social change. He dedicated most of his life searching for the radical subject and contributing to man's liberation. And as implied in the previous discussion, possibilities for social change do not emerge out of nowhere. The first step here, as I understand and interpret Marcuse, is to sustain and strengthen dialectical thinking. This is so because the negation brought about by dialectical thinking brings individuals closer to the realities of oppression, domination, and control, which does not solely liberate our minds, but also allows for a reinterpretation and reimagining of the world we live in, which runs counter to positivist thinking that simply seeks to describe the actual. Hence, dialectical thinking is emancipatory in essence. So far, what we can observe is how dialectical thinking, by exposing the intolerable existing conditions of humanity, opens images and visions of emancipation in a better life. This brings us to the next idea, utopia. As I will later present in the paper, maintaining one's ability to imagine was something Marcuse held on to because it provided a promise that what is actual is not necessarily what ought to be. And as stated already, dialectical thinking's bringing forth of visions of emancipation guides individuals to having alternative perspective of what is in the status quo. Utopia for him was a tool that ought to remain in the individual's consciousness. But for some reason, such notion is simply considered pointless and insignificant in relation to the actual material conditions, Marcuse asserts. In an essay on liberation, he mentions that people despise and denigrate utopia because they are afraid to lose their scientific character or validity behind their work. But he reasons that all the more is utopia needed because seeing how the world has become problematic and perverted as a consequence of an utterly repressive society suggests the need for another more livable place for individuals. As Angela Davis powerfully puts it, this is not the way things are supposed to be. This might be the way they are now, but they are not supposed to be this way. They will not always be this way. This tells us that despite the intolerable conditions in society, there will always be a means to transform them because they are not always like that and are not supposed to remain that way. Hence, imagination takes us far and invites us to ponder that if historically society has been changing, then the current conditions are also subject to change. Now, I argue, following Marcuse, that having utopian visions is not enough if we were to transform society. For him, inasmuch as exposing the appalling conditions of society and developing utopian thought is itself emancipatory, there must be a way to break away from utopian thought and actualize them. This is where the paper elucidates and reconstructs Marcuse's activist model of critical theory. This is important as it clarifies Marcuse's critical theory as a theory of social change. Here I present his critical theory as activist for three reasons. One, in the process of dialectically exposing the horrid situation in advanced industrial societies, which are highly democratic and capitalistic, he sought through his writings to amplify the need to radically transform it. Two, in doing so, he engaged with social movements and political actions that aided him in further elucidating his points without sounding too obscure or confined in abstract thinking. And three, he himself participated in various activist movements, although mainly as a scholar intellectual rather than an organizer. In Marcuse, we see theory's constant engagement with social movements, allowing for the necessary readjustments of theory, providing a way to open and unblock the restrictions that a theory may have if it keeps scrupulously above the real ground of political movements. By laying out these important premises that express his activist model of critical theory, we infer that for Marcuse, dialectical thinking and utopia are significant, but can also offer so much more. They inform us of the possibilities of radically transforming society. Moreover, the ending of utopia, not in a sense of giving up utopian visions, happens when individuals concretely struggle for the liberation they deserve as a result of seeing the contradictions and developing utopian visions that allowed them to imagine a different potential world for all. This was made even more evident when the student movement broke out in the 60s. He paid close attention to such event and even participated in some of its sit-ins. These protests were directed toward a plethora of issues at the time, from the Vietnam War to Black individuals' human rights, among other things. This made this one-dimensional man a tool rather than an expression of hopelessness and nihilism, to invoke the Great Refusal, which is a political individualistic refusal and revolt against the system of domination and oppression exacted by the bourgeois society. Oddly enough, this catapulted Marcuse's name in the public eye and even became recognized by many as the father of the New Left because of his unrelenting commitment in supporting protest movements both in writing as an intellectual and participating on the ground. Unfortunately, however, Marcuse's role as the guru of the New Left faded slowly in the scene. His transitory celebrity status as the guru of the New Left between the 60s and 70s and the considered failure of the resistance movement, such as the global student movement, against oppressions in forms of domination in the status quo, allowed the establishment to repress the necessity of utopia and possibilities for social change. That is, preventing people from imagining and working toward better alternatives. But as I will show later, now more than ever, his activist model of critical theory is relevant. With Black Lives Matter, protests against the anti-terror law, and other protests going on in the domestic and international spaces, clarifying Marcuse's activist model of critical theory on how it relates with utopia that promotes possibilities for social change communicates a strong message on the value of concrete struggles and of not giving up any hope. Because, as articulated already, things are not always like how they are, and they are not supposed to remain that way. History reminds us that several socio-historical developments have existed that reinforce the narrative of having possibilities for social change. For instance, developments in wages, right to suffrage for women, and the like, did not happen because of the benevolence of the people in power, but because of the people's collective action on the ground, a message we can clearly infer from Marcuse. In the final analysis, what this paper seeks to point out is how Marcuse's critical theory, which I refer to as an activist model of critical theory, along with his utopian thought, promote possibilities for social change. We realize that Marcuse's negative thinking, as most critical theorists in his time did, exposed the anomalies and perversion visible that were not recognized by many. Indeed, this awareness of society's irrationality under the guise of rationality holds a principal value as it opens our minds in imagining alternatives or simply developing utopia. Again, this utopia, however, must be transcended by realizing them through concrete struggles in attaining true liberation. Now, by reconstructing his activist model of critical theory in the attempt of providing a more sustained and organized discussion on his theory of social change, the paper hopes to contribute in the liberation of one's mind, which is a precondition for a freer and more humane society. And understand that utopia is not an unattainable perfect world, but a better world that can be attained so long as the hope and the will to get there remained. Thank you so much. That's all po.
Thank you, Allison. So the floor is now open for your questions, comments, and insights for Allison's project.
Hello, Franz. Can I ask Allison a question?
Yes, Sir Pao.
Hello, Allison. Good evening.
Hi, sir. Good evening.
Yeah, so I'm glad that you are already working on your proposal, which seems to me quite promising. Well, in the sense that I think I think you're the first. I don't know. Have you surveyed the library whether there are older works on Marcuse written before in
Wala, sir.
UST?
Wala, sir.
Wala. So on that note, then I think your thesis, if ever it will push through, um, will be the first thesis on Marcuse. Okay,
Mhm.
in UST. So yeah, so I support that. My question is, well, first because your argument, I think the main argument of your work is that Marcuse proposes an activist uh, a type of critical theory that you term activist, no?
Yes, sir.
May obviously that in a way contrasts is in contrast to rather the style of critical theory that we find in the contemporaries of Marcuse, Adorno and Horkheimer in particular, which you pointed out in a way in your presentation, and the brand of critical theory, uh, as you claim, was presented by Marcuse. I hope that because I don't know, I don't know if you mentioned it in your work, whether towards the end of their careers, uh, there was there and precisely because they had different ways of understanding the role of critique, you know.
Mhm.
Marcuse and Adorno had a falling out. I don't know. I don't know if it was really a falling out or whether it was just simply because they had different views on specific matters, and that Adorno, let's let's just say that Adorno was not too fond of activism
Mm-mm.
as as a kind of political praxis, because for Adorno, philosophy itself, as critique, critical theory itself is praxis, is already a kind of praxis. Now, of course, he is sometimes accused of, you know, of neglecting what truly matters, which is the actual praxis in the street, and of course, also accused of a kind of, you know, ir- a kind of abstract irrationalism, maybe, that does not really translate into something practical. In contrast to Marcuse, who, as you pointed out already, became, whether he liked it or not, became the father of the New Left in the United States. Basically, the New Left doesn't have a single face. I mean, doesn't but the New Left is more like an umbrella term for uh, many groups, as a matter of fact. But the common denominator is that they believe that theory must be translated into a kind of political praxis in the streets. And so the term that you use is activism in order to uh, refer to that type of praxis. S- Maybe that exchange between Adorno and Horkheimer is something that you might want to look into
Yes, sir.
further.
Yes, sir. 1969, the correspondence between them.
Yeah, that's one. That's one. But at the same time, also towards the end, it seems like Marcuse himself. This was late 60s to the early 70s. He was denied his teaching post. He was denied his teaching post in in a couple of universities. Um, even the American government uh, was at the forefront of this denial, right?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Of his teaching post, and to some extent, towards that, to some extent, I believe that because of that, because he couldn't get a teaching post, well, not only that, but at the same time, I think towards the end he became disillusioned also with the uh, effectivity, if you want, for lack of a better term, or practicality of what you call activism. And that one of his last works, perhaps his last work, is something that resembles the posthumous work of Adorno, Adorno's aesthetic theory. Marcuse wrote, and as a matter of fact, he saw the publication of the aesthetic dimension. Adorno's aesthetic theory was only published posthumously, but aesthetic dimension, if you read it, it seems like uh, there is a kind of indirect, I call this indirect acceptance of a similar point that Adorno made in his aesthetic theory, which is only the artwork is able to redeem us from social, uh, Adorno called it the culture industry. Uh, uh, but again, for lack of a better term, let's just call it social or political pathology, or pathology. So even Marcuse at the end made a similar, if not the same, argument that Adorno made in the aesthetic theory, which is that the only way that can redeem us and save us from the wrong state of things is art. Not because for a while he was identified with the justification that violence is necessary, but of course he was denying that too. But maybe because he was also denying that he is for violence, he had to sort of justify that towards the end, no, that
Mm-mm.
maybe it's not really violence, it's something else.
Mm-mm.
It's art. It's something that you might want to look into. Kasi yes, he was identified with a kind of philosophical activism, but towards the end, it seems like he shifted his attention or focus or strategy, perhaps. Um, and so, therefore, maybe some sort of yung parang I don't know how to term it, but some sort of periodization. Maybe in this particular period of his career, he was really up. He was really advocating this kind of activism, but towards the end and so on and so forth. Baka magandang gawin mo yun
Uh,
so that at the end, when people read your work, it's not simply it's not simply I call this an apologist,
mm.
writing on Marcuse. It's
Yeah.
actually a critical reading of Marcuse. And on the one hand, you of course identify the strengths of his work, but on the other hand, uh,
Mm-mm.
there are also some loopholes or some problems. Parang ganun.
Mm-mm.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. Yeah, I think that actually really makes a lot of sense. I've actually read a few articles regarding his aesthetic theory and how many commentators were saying that he basically now agrees with Adorno. So yeah, I may definitely have to delineate or distinguish the different positions of Marcuse. But yeah, going back also to the correspondence between Adorno and Marcuse, I think that's also very important, especially because, for example, when the students were harassing Adorno for not supporting them, I think in the correspondence, Marcuse, um, although he defended the students, um, he basically also says that Adorno is a very important figure because without him, the students would not be able to really have good ideas about criticizing society. So, in a sense, he was also trying to defend Adorno from the mockeries of the students, and he respected Adorno so much. They just had, yeah, as you pointed out, sir, differences in certain areas like activism. But yeah, that's a really good point, sir. I think I really need to delve deeper into that, like how his position changed throughout the end of his career when he was about to, well, in fact, when he was at the end of his career, so he changed a bit of his position there. But yeah, I'm hoping to be able to siguro reconstruct the period where he was very supportive still of the students, and then I'll try to also draw that distinction just to be, as you said, sir, not be apologetic about Marcuse. So yeah, that's really really helpful, sir. Thank you.
Okay,
Okay.
thank you. Thank you, Allison. Just a little bit more. Idadagdag ko lang. And then at the same time, the question also whether his brand of activism is something relevant today.
Mm, yes sir, yes
How
sir.
yung para bang yes, at a particular period of his career he was advocating this kind of activism, but and then there was a shift or a change in attitude, a kind
Mm,
of disillusionment, and then the other question is, so what is the relevance of his activism for us here in the
mm,
Philippines
mm,
in particular?
mm, mm, mm. Sige, sir. I'll also I took note of that as well, sir. So I will also delve into that and hopefully be able to cover it in my thesis as well. So thank you, sir, for that. Mm. I've
Okay.
actually read also different what they call this discussions on how he's relevant even in contemporary movements, but I'll definitely try to also narrow it as well to the Philippines if it's possible. Yes, sir.
Okay. Thank you for the responses and the questions. Any other questions? Uh, Anyway, if you don't have any questions, I actually want to comment and ask a question.
Sige, sir.
So uh, that's a very interesting proposal, Allison. I was wondering, can the Great Refusal gather enough critical mass to organize a collective movement? And to follow up that question, I also have an issue with activism, because when you talk about activism, it's a collective movement. And by
Mm-mm.
the way, I understand the idea of one dimensionality. It's more of an introspective uh, critical thinking. Okay, uh, if that is the case, wouldn't a collective movement be subject to an instance of one-dimensional thinking? Because if you think about it, uh, despite the multiplicity of voices, the multiplicity of views, they are all subject to their own one-dimensional form of thinking. So let's use the United States as an example. There are people that are one-dimensionally fixated with Trump, and there are some people that are also one-dimensionally fixated with Biden. Okay, so
Mm-mm.
my point is, wouldn't it be a problem to actually talk about activism as a collective when you begin to employ Marcuse's critique of one-dimensionality?
Sige, sir. So I'll start with the first question on the Great Refusal. Um, like I think the question was on how to gather masses. Tama ba yun, sir? I think what was my.
My question is, can it gather enough
Mm,
critical mass to be somewhat relevant, or to at least
mm,
garner enough force to actually change anything or something?
yeah. Right. So maybe I would start with his essay on liberation, where he talked, for example, during his time in the 1960s, he says that the Great Refusal has various forms. For example, the anti-war movement or the anti-Vietnam movement. That was an example of of the Great Refusal. We had different movements as well in South American countries and of course in America. And I think to bring that to the current context now, I think we also see different forms of the Great Refusal. And this is what's interesting about the Great Refusal, is that it's not very clear. It basically just talks about refusing the system. And I think right now, for example, if you look at Hong Kong with their protests, if you look at Thailand with their protests, if you look at the Black Lives Matter with their protests, I think these are forms or examples of the Great Refusal. Now, are they very effective? That's something that we are yet to see. But I think that they're able to spark conversation. They're able to move the conversation on climate change. They're able to move the conversation on Black individuals' rights. They're able to move the conversation on these issues that traditionally were not even supposed to be talked about in public, or not even supposed to be talked about by individuals. So I think that it's able to really get enough mass support, but in terms of its effectivity, that's where it becomes tricky, because no one really can tell. Although we have seen in the past, for example, with the civil rights movement, which I think is still also an example of the Great Refusal. It was during the time where Marcuse was also still alive. I think they were able to, for example, shift legislation in to be more fair in terms of work or employability, for example, to Black individuals. They were able to desegregate Black individuals, for example. I mean, yeah. And so I think that those are some examples also of how the Great Refusal were effective. So I don't know if that makes sense. The second one on activism, I think that really makes a lot of sense. I actually was not able to think so much about that, but I think that, well, first and foremost, the paper will definitely not defend all forms of protests, and I think that's where your question becomes relevant, sir, because I think protest movements can be dogmatic, or are actually dogmatic. For example, as you mentioned, the Trump supporters really are Trump supporters. The Biden supporters are really Biden supporters. And that's why I think we also need to be critical of the protest movements that we're talking about, because I think activism is a double-edged sword. I think it cuts both ways. It can be used for good. It can also be used for bad um, intent. Like, for example, in America with QAnon, which is which is basically coming from this baseless internet conspiracy theory that world leaders and Hollywood stars are Satanist pedophiles without any evidence whatsoever, and they're just protesting in the streets. Or if you talk about anti-mask protesters who support Trump without actually regard to science when it comes to the effectivity of masks, I think that's where we have to also question these activist movements. And even the Black Lives Matter, for example, how violent are they? Do we allow violence, for example? To what extent do we allow them to protest and things like that? So yeah, I think you make a lot of sense there, sir. I will have to think through that, but I think through more on that. But yeah, I think that would be my initial response for now.
Yeah, just a follow-up question, Allison. I think that's a very good perspective. Actually, what I wanted to suggest is to look into the possibility of perhaps providing an internal critique of
Mm-mm.
Marcuse's idea of one-dimensionality, that even in the case of the possibility of a great refusal, the great refusal can revert back into a
Mm,
different way of one-dimensionality.
right.
So I hope you consider including that in your thesis or your paper. Thank you.
Yes, sir. That's very insightful, sir. Yeah, thank you so much. I also took note of that. I think that should be included as well in the paper. Thank you, sir.
So are there any other questions that you'd like to ask? Anyone? You may use the chat box or you may use your microphone to ask the question. Okay. So
Um,
yes.
Hello. Um, may kunting question na ako. Um,
Yes, sir.
okay, nakalimutan. Okay. Regarding what you said about dialectic, no, negative dialectic, wherein there is also the play of Utopia. So where does Utopia come in? Is it before the
Mm,
struggle, before the dialectic move, what struggle, or it comes out along when somebody struggles? When you struggle in, for example, in your ano no, in the ideas, no, struggle against the dominant force, for example, yung sinasabi mong utopia, saka lang ba lumalabas o meron ng utopia, that's why you initiate that negative dialectic.
mm,
And another question, second question is that Marcuse, I think, was reacting against different forms of what they consider as dominant, and also against the dialectical thinking. For example, positivist ideas, and also instrumental reason. Am I correct?
yes,
Now,
sir. Yes, sir.
if you're going to ano, and also I think capitalism,
Mm,
class society, if you're going to situate your development of your thesis now, where do you, what kind of what kind of issues that would fall under the critique of Marcuse, for example? Kasi before, can we still use that technology, instrumental
mm,
reason, capitalism, and so on? So
mm.
two questions. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Yeah, thank you, sir. So for the first question, which comes first? Yeah, I'm actually not very sure. I have to read more on this, but I think it probably has. I mean, I think dialectical thinking has to come first because in it you're able to measure up what's existing right now and critique it and see the flaws in it. And I think once you see the flaws, once you see the pathological tendencies of society, once you see the perversions in society, I think what follows there is an imagination of a different reality. Although I'm not again particularly sure, I'll have to read more on this. But yeah, right now I think that would be my response. I think it has to come dialectic or criticizing society, for example, has to start first. And I feel like utopia or the idea of imagining a different reality follows, because now you are aware already of how people have become so wasteful of the environment. You're now aware of how people have not really been very fair to certain individuals or collective identities in society. So yeah, but that's my initial response. The second one, which what could possibly be my critique, or what could possibly be the specific area in society right now that I would um, use to criticize, or if yeah, something like that. um I don't know, I feel like Marcuse's critique of capitalism, Marcuse's critique of positivism still actually holds water. I feel like right now, more so right now, where technology has really taken over our lives, when you have um, social media absorbing our time and absorbing our attention. I feel like all the more is his critique of science and technology or positivism and even capitalism become more relevant. I think it's more relevant now that we see that it's more advanced, that the algorithms, for example, in social media can trick you and can just basically manipulate you. And I feel like Marcuse would criticize that even right now. And so I think his critique of society, like even Adorno and Horkheimer, I feel like they actually are still very much relevant. And so I feel like those are the same kinds of areas that I would also be employing, or I would also be looking at in my paper. Yeah, I don't know if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Welcome po.
Okay. Any other questions for Allison? You may use the microphone, or you can type your question in the chat box. Anyone? Okay. I think no one has a question for Allison, and we can conclude this work in progress seminar. Thank you very much for the interesting proposal, Allison.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much po.
Sir Franz.
Hello. I
Hello, sir.
thank you, RT. Thank you for the three presenters for tonight, Dr. Jove, Jim Aguas, Dr. RT Pada, and Mr. Alison Ladero. Thank you very much. And also, we thank everyone who participated, who joined our webinar for tonight. Ilan ba tayo ngayon? There are 21 participants. So in spite of a suspension of class in UST, you still were able to be with us tonight. So thank you. And for our next work in progress session, that will be on the 16th of November. That's a Monday. And there are yes, there are four presenters. We have Dr. Ian Paking, who will present his proposed project titled Patrimonial Authoritarianism in the Philippines and its Psychosocial Significance. And then we have Dr. Rainiel Reyes. He will present Becoming Democracy in the Time of COVID-19 Pandemic. And then we have two students from the graduate school, our very own Sir Emer Gonzalez and Miss Jillian Garcia. So that's on the 16th of November. Okay, so thank you very much. Meron po bang announcement? Anybody who wants to announce something? Oo nga po pala, this coming Saturday we'll be having our first of a 5-lecture series on ethics in action, and we have Professor Roland Simbulan as the first speaker. That's on November 7, 9 a.m. to 12 noon. So tinang lang po namin kung paano yung possibility na maka-attend yung mga gustong maka-attend. Any other announcement? from the participants? Baka meron po kayong gustong i-announce. Sir Joby. I think Sir Joby is here.
Yep.
Nga naman.
Wala naman, Sir Franz. Okay lang. Thank you.
Ano ba? I think Anton and the group, they also have an event this coming Saturday.
Noche.
Noche. Yeah. Noche.
Oo,
So
nasa ano naman yata, nasa Facebook.
sige. So again, thank you very much. At mag-ingat po ang lahat.
Salamat po, Sir Franz.
Thank you
po lahat.
Maraming salamat.
Salamat po.
Thank you po.
Salamat po.